The Interstellar Academy of Advanced Studies occupied a space station that had been designed by committee, which explained why it looked like 7 different architectural philosophies had gotten into a fistfight and all lost. Floating serenely in neutral space between 5 different stellar empires, it represented the galaxy's most ambitious attempt at shared education, which was another way of saying it was a bureaucratic nightmare held together by translation software and mutual tolerance. The Academy had been established 2 centuries ago on a simple premise. If you forced the children of various spacefaring species to sit in classrooms together, maybe they'd stop trying to blow each other up quite so enthusiastically. The results had been mixed, though mixed was a diplomatic term that meant, at least the station hasn't exploded yet. Professor Cade Morrison stood at the front of Lecture Hall 7, watching her students file in with the expression of someone who had seen this exact scenario play out roughly 400 times before, and found it only marginally more interesting than watching paint dry in zero gravity. She was human, which automatically made her suspect in the eyes of about half her students, and she had the kind of face that suggested she'd stopped being impressed by cosmic wonders around the same time she'd graded her first essay on Why My Species is Obviously Superior, a thesis. The course was officially titled Comparative Cultural Studies, Symbolic Systems, and Social Cohesion. Unofficially, it was known as that class where you have to pretend. Other species aren't complete idiots. Which was required for graduation, because the Galactic Educational Accord had determined that ignorance was breeding more wars than actual territorial disputes. The students themselves were a collection that would have made a xenobiologist weep with joy and a social coordinator weep with despair. There were Kelthrians, who looked like someone had crossed a mantis with a philosophy professor and given the result an superiority complex. There were Morphids, gelatinous beings who communicated through color shifts and had to wear translation harnesses to avoid literally screaming their emotions at everyone. A pair of Vexian twins sat in the back, their crystalline forms refracting the station's artificial light into annoying patterns that suggested they'd positioned themselves specifically to be irritating. And then there was Dravik Korhena, a Valtharan, who entered the classroom the way conquerors entered vanquished cities, with entirely too much confidence and not nearly enough self-awareness. Valtharans were reptilian in the way that made evolutionary biologists ask uncomfortable questions about convergent evolution and militaristic societies. Dravik stood roughly 7 feet tall, with scales that shimmered between deep crimson and burnished bronze, depending on his emotional state. Currently, they suggested smugness mixed with anticipation, which was his default setting. His species had controlled a modest empire spanning 40 systems for the past 3,000 years, and they'd never let anyone forget it for even a moment. He took his seat in the 3rd row, center position, where he could be seen making dismissive gestures and eye contact with other students who shared his particular view that being assigned to a class taught by a human was somewhere between an insult and a cosmic joke. "Let's begin," Professor Morrison said, her voice carrying the kind of flat affect that teachers developed after realizing that enthusiasm was wasted on students who were only attending to check a box. Today we're continuing our examination of cultural symbols and their role in species identity. Specifically, we're looking at flags, banners, standards, and other visual representations that various civilizations have used to represent collective identity. One of the Kelthrians, her mandibles clicking in what translated as polite interest, raised a forelimb. "Professor, I've completed the readings on Terran vexillology. I found it fascinating that Earth had so many different flags for such a small planet. Over time, I mean. Hundreds of nations, each with distinct symbolic representation. Thousands, actually," Morrison corrected, pulling up a holographic display that showed a cascading waterfall of human flags throughout history. Earth never achieved global political unity until the unification crisis. So yes, we had rather a lot of flags, each one representing a different group of humans who decided they were sufficiently different from their neighbors to require their own symbol. Dravik's scales shifted toward a color that the translation software rendered as derisive amusement. He leaned back in his seat, which creaked under his bulk. With respect, Professor, doesn't that rather prove the point that humanity was hopelessly fragmented? The Valthuran Empire has flown the same banner for 3 millennia. One people, one symbol, one unbroken tradition. Your species couldn't maintain a consistent identity for more than a few generations. Several students shifted uncomfortably. This was the kind of comment that could either deflate into awkward silence or inflate into the kind of argument that made the station's conflict resolution team groan audibly. Morrison didn't even blink. An interesting observation, Cadet Corps Henna. Tell me, in those 3,000 years, how many times has the Valthuran Empire reformed its governmental structure? Dravik's scales flickered with pride. We have no need for reformation. Our systems are perfected. That's rather the point. Right. And how many internal resistance movements has your empire experienced in that time? The scales shifted slightly toward a color suggesting irritation. Traitors and malcontents exist in every society, Professor. They are dealt with according to law. Morrison made a note on her datapad, which was the teacher equivalent of loading a weapon. And these traitors and malcontents, did any of them ever desecrate the Valthuran banner as part of their resistance? Of course not, Dravik said. And now his voice carried the kind of offense that suggested she'd just questioned whether gravity existed. The banner of the crimson sky is sacred. To burn it, tear it, or show it disrespect is a capital offense. No true Valthuran would ever consider such blasphemy. Fascinating, Morrison said in a tone that suggested she found it about as fascinating as a particularly boring rock. So your symbol is protected by law, enforced by the threat of execution. It is protected by honor and tradition, Dravik corrected, his scales now fully shifted to aggressive crimson. Concepts your species seems to struggle with, if your own history is any indication. How many times have humans burned their own flags, Professor? I've done some research myself. There are recordings of Terrans setting fire to their own national symbols in protests, riots, political demonstrations. It's disgraceful. A ripple went through the classroom. Several students were now watching with a kind of attention that suggested entertainment might be imminent. The morphid near the window shifted to a color that translated roughly as, "Oh, this is getting interesting." Morrison set down her datapad and walked around to the front of her desk, leaning against it with her arms crossed. You're correct. Humans have burned their own flags, many times, in many contexts. Dravik's scales practically glowed with vindication. Then you admit your species lacks the fundamental respect for symbols that marks a mature civilization. You treat your own cultural representations as disposable. I admit, Morrison said slowly, that humans have a complicated relationship with symbols. But I'm curious about something, Cadet. You've spent time researching Terran flag burning. Did you bring an example? Dravik's expression, as much as a reptilian face could express such things, suggested he'd been waiting for this exact question. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folded piece of synthetic fabric. With theatrical precision, he stood and shook it out, revealing a flag, blue field, circlet of stars. the emblem of the Terran coalition that had preceded the current unified Earth government. "This," he said, holding it up for the class to see, "represents your people's allegiance, their identity, their heritage." His scales shifted to a color that suggested supreme confidence. "I purchased it from a cultural artifact dealer. Authentic, certified, a genuine Terran flag from your homeworld." The classroom had gone completely silent. Even the morphid had stopped shifting colors. "I challenge you, Professor Morrison," Dravik continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who believed he'd already won an argument. "Defend this symbol. Explain to this class why it deserves respect. Justify your species' casual disregard for its own representations. Tell us why we should take seriously a people who treat their own identity as something that can be destroyed on a whim." He held the flag out toward her, scales shimmering with what could only be described as smug satisfaction. Morrison looked at the flag, then at Dravik, then back at the flag. Her expression never changed from that same flat, unimpressed neutrality that could have been carved from stone. "Okay," she said. She walked over, took the flag from his hands, carried it to the small disposal unit built into the corner of the classroom, and set it on fire. The synthetic fabric caught quickly, burning with a clean blue flame that lasted perhaps 15 seconds before reducing the entire thing to a small pile of ash. The classroom's air recyclers kicked in automatically, whisking away the smoke. Morrison turned back to face the class, dusting off her hands. The silence that followed was the kind that suggested everyone's brains had briefly stopped working while they processed what they'd just witnessed. Dravik stood frozen, his scales cycling rapidly through colors that the translation software couldn't quite keep up with, eventually settling on something between shocked and victorious confusion. You just," he stammered, which was impressive because Valtherans prided themselves on rhetorical control. "You burned your own flag." "I did," Morrison confirmed, returning to lean against her desk. "Took about 15 seconds. Fairly anticlimactic, honestly. I've seen better burns. That synthetic fabric doesn't have much drama to it." Dravik's scales settled into deep, satisfied crimson. He looked around at his classmates, many of whom were staring at their professor with expressions ranging from shock to something that might have been second-hand embarrassment. "Then you prove my point entirely. You humans have no respect for your own symbols. You're so fragmented, so individualistic, so unable to maintain collective identity that you'll destroy your own representations without a second thought." This is exactly what I was saying. Your species lacks the fundamental cohesion that marks a true civilization. He sat down, scales practically glowing with triumph. Several other students were nodding, and Morrison could see them mentally composing the messages they'd send home about the human professor who'd burned her own flag in front of class. Morrison let the moment stretch out, watching Dravik settle into his victory. Then she smiled, and it was not a particularly warm smile. "Let's talk about why I was able to do that," she said. "Cadet Corhenna, you stated that the Valtheran banner is protected by law, that desecration is a capital offense. Is that correct?" "Of course," Dravik said, still radiating confidence. "So a Valtheran citizen cannot burn their own flag without facing execution?" "Correct. It would be unthinkable. Because it's illegal. Because it's sacred," Dravik insisted. "But backed up by law," Morrison pressed. "Backed up by the threat of death. Without that law, without that threat, would the banner still be sacred?" Dravik's scales flickered slightly. "The law exists because the sacredness exists. We're not barbarians who require threats to respect our traditions." And yet the law exists." Morrison pulled up another holographic display, this one showing Valtharan legal codes. According to the Unified Statutes of the Crimson Empire, Section 847, Subsection 12, any individual found guilty of desecrating, defacing, destroying, or showing deliberate disrespect to the banner of the Crimson Sky shall be executed by neural disintegration, and their name shall be stricken from all records. That's quite a threat for something that's supposedly respected out of pure cultural reverence. The law exists for the small minority who might forget their duty, Dravik said, but his scales were shifting again, becoming less certain. Right. The law exists to enforce respect for the symbol. Morrison nodded. Now, let me ask you something else. In Valtharan military tradition, what happens to enemy banners captured in battle? Dravik's scales shifted back toward pride. This was safer territory. They are burned in the Victory Square on the capital world. It's a great honor to present a captured banner for the burning ceremony. It demonstrates absolute triumph over the enemy. So, Valtharans burn flags. We burn enemy flags, Dravik corrected quickly. The symbols of defeated foes, it's completely different from burning one's own banner. Is it? Morrison pulled up another display, this one showing historical footage. Because it seems to me you're making the same fundamental assessment, that burning a flag is a powerful symbolic act. You just believe it should only be done to other people's symbols, while being absolutely forbidden for your own. The act itself is powerful enough to be both a war crime and a victory celebration, depending on whose flag is burning. That's different, Dravik insisted, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. We would never disrespect our own symbol because we have unity. Cultural cohesion. The very suggestion is absurd. Let me show you something, Morrison said, and her fingers danced across her control pad. The holographic display changed, showing a series of images from Earth's history. This is footage from various points in Terran history. I'm going to show you humans burning the American flag, which was one of the major national symbols before unification. The images flickered past. Protesters in the 1960s, war resistors in the 2000s, political demonstrators across decades, each one showing humans setting fire to their own national flags. This is disgraceful, Dravik muttered, but he couldn't look away. This is protest, Morrison corrected. These people burned their own flag because they believed their government had failed to live up to the values that flag, Afeniko, supposedly represented. They burned it because they loved their country enough to risk prosecution, social ostracism, and violence to demand it be better. They burned it because they understood something fundamental. The symbol is not the thing it represents. She pulled up another image, this one showing American soldiers raising a flag at Iwo Jima, one of the most famous photographs in human history. These soldiers fought and died for this symbol. Thousands of humans gave their lives defending what this flag represented. And yet, a few decades later, other Americans burned that exact same symbol to protest policies they believed betrayed those soldiers' sacrifice. Both groups believed they were honoring the same values. Both were willing to suffer for their beliefs. That's contradiction, Dravik said. That's chaos. That's exactly what I'm saying about human fragmentation. That's evolution, Morrison countered. That's a civilization that's constantly questioning itself, constantly trying to live up to its own stated ideals, constantly willing to destroy its own sacred symbols when those symbols become hollow representations instead of living values. She changed the display again, now showing Valtharan history. Let me contrast this with your empire. You've had the same banner for 3,000 years, the same governmental structure, The same legal codes, largely unchanged. And in those 3,000 years, you've had 17 major revolts, each one crushed with overwhelming force. You've never had a successful reform movement originating from within your own population. Every single time your empire has changed, it's been from external pressure or complete systemic collapse. Dravik's scales had shifted to a darker color now, something that suggested defensive anger. We maintain order. We preserve tradition. This is strength, not weakness. You maintain stagnation, Morrison said, her voice not unkind but absolutely unyielding. You've created a system where questioning the symbol is literally punishable by death, which means you've made it impossible to question whether the symbol still represents anything meaningful. You've confused the representation with the thing being represented. You worship the map instead of the territory. She walked back toward the flag she'd burned, gesturing at the small pile of ash. I could burn this flag because it's just fabric and dye. The ideas it represents, the values it supposedly embodies, those aren't in the flag. They're in actions, in choices, in the willingness to actually fight for those values even when it's inconvenient. Especially when it's inconvenient. But without respect for the symbol, how do you maintain unity? One of the Kelthrians asked, genuinely curious now. How do you keep a civilization together if anyone can just destroy the representations whenever they disagree? Morrison smiled. That's the thing about humanity that drives other species crazy. We maintain unity through constant argument. We stay together by never quite agreeing on what we're staying together for. It's messy, it's chaotic. It looks like we're always on the verge of flying apart, and sometimes we do fly apart. We've had civil wars, revolutions, political upheavals that would have ended other civilizations. She pulled up another display, this one showing Earth's current status. And yet, here we are. A unified planetary government that took us 4,000 years of recorded history to achieve. We got here not by making our symbols sacred and unchangeable, but by being willing to burn them down and build new ones when they stopped serving us. We got here by making sure that no symbol, no tradition, no law was more important than the living, breathing people it was supposed to serve. Dravik was silent now, his scales a muted gray that suggested deep thought rather than anger. The Valtheran Third Dynasty, Morrison continued, pulling up more historical records. Collapsed in 2847 by Earth calendar. Took the entire empire with it for nearly a century. Do you know why? Economic factors, Dravik said quietly. Resource depletion in the core systems. That's what your histories say, Morrison agreed. But I've read the analysis from external observers. The Kelthrian Institute of Historical Studies did a comprehensive examination. The Third Dynasty collapsed because it couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. The resource depletion was predictable decades in advance, but the governmental structure had no mechanism for fundamental reform. Suggesting changes to how the empire managed resources was treated the same as questioning the empire's legitimacy, which was treated the same as desecrating the banner, which was punishable by death. She let that sink in for a moment. So instead of adapting, instead of reforming, instead of questioning whether the old ways still served the people, the Third Dynasty just kept enforcing the same policies until the entire system collapsed. Millions died. Billions suffered, all because the symbol of the empire had become more important than the actual people living under it. That's a simplification, Dravik said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's always a simplification when we talk about the fall of civilizations, Morrison acknowledged. But the core truth remains. Your ancestors chose to let the empire burn rather than let someone burn the banner. They chose symbolic purity over practical survival. She looked around at the rest of the class. This is what happens when you make symbols sacred. When you make it illegal or unthinkable to question the representations, you make it impossible to question whether those representations still mean anything. You create a system that looks stable and unified from the outside, but is actually rigid and brittle. The first time you encounter a problem that requires fundamental change, you shatter. The morphid had shifted to a deep blue color that translated as thoughtful melancholy. One of the Vexian twins spoke up, their voice chiming like crystal. But Professor, doesn't this create instability? If anyone can reject the symbols at any time, how do you maintain enough cohesion to function as a society? That's the tension, Morrison admitted. And humans haven't solved it perfectly. We've had plenty of moments where the center didn't hold, where we fragmented into violence and chaos because we couldn't agree on what our symbols meant anymore. But here's the thing. We survived those moments. We came out the other side, often with new symbols, new systems, new ways of organizing ourselves. She pulled up a final image. The current flag of unified Earth, a design that incorporated elements from dozens of previous national flags, creating something that was simultaneously familiar and entirely new. This is our current planetary flag. It was designed 50 years ago when we achieved full political integration. It's already controversial. There are movements to change it, to add more representation for this or that group, to modify the symbolism to reflect current values rather than historical compromises. And you'll let them change it? Dravik asked. And there was something in his voice now that wasn't quite mockery anymore. Something closer to genuine curiosity. If enough people agree, absolutely, Morrison said. It's a flag. It's fabric and dye and digital patterns. What matters is whether it still represents something meaningful to the people who live under it. The moment it stops doing that, it's just decoration. She walked back to her desk and picked up her datapad. Now, Cadet Korhena, there's something else you should know about the flag you brought to class. Dravik looked up, scales shifting slightly with renewed attention. It was a fake, Morrison said calmly. I had it made specifically for this lesson. Cost me about 15 credits from a digital fabricator. The proportions were slightly wrong, the color balance was off by about 3%, and the material was completely inauthentic. An actual historical Terran Coalition flag would cost thousands of credits from a legitimate dealer, and I'm certainly not rich enough to buy one just to burn it for pedagogical purposes. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't shock. This was the dawning realization of being thoroughly, completely outmaneuvered. You planned this, Dravik said slowly. I planned this, Morrison confirmed. I've been teaching this class for 12 years, Cadet. You're not the first student to bring up human flag burning as evidence of our cultural inferiority. You're not even the first Valtheran to do it. So yes, I keep a cheap reproduction flag ready for exactly this teachable moment. Dravik's scales went through a rapid series of color changes that suggested his emotions were too complicated for the translation software to keep up with. Finally, they settled on a shade that looked like deep purple mixed with bronze, which the software tentatively rendered as embarrassed respect. You set me up, he said. I taught you, Morrison corrected. There's a difference. You came in here believing that respect for symbols equals civilization, that unity requires sacred representations that can never be questioned. You challenged me to defend a symbol, assuming that my willingness to defend it would prove human attachment to meaningless tribalism. and that my failure to defend it would prove human cultural weakness. She smiled again, and this time it was almost warm. Instead, you got a lesson in why humans burned their way to the stars, while other civilizations polished their banners and wondered why the universe kept changing without their permission. The class sat in silence, processing this. Finally, the Kelthrian who'd spoken earlier raised a forelimb again. "Professor, may I ask a potentially offensive question?" "That's what class is for," Morrison said. "If you're willing to burn your own symbols, if you treat your representations as disposable, what do humans actually hold sacred? What values are you unwilling to compromise?" Morrison considered this for a long moment. "The right to burn the flag," she said finally. "The right to question authority. The right to disagree with your government, your culture, your fellow citizens without being executed for it. The right to be wrong, change your mind, and try again. Those are human sacred values, if we have any. And the beautiful irony is that those values require us to be willing to destroy the very symbols that represent them if those symbols ever become more important than the values themselves." She looked at Dravik. "Your empire makes flag desecration a capital offense because the flag has to be protected by force to remain meaningful. My species protects the right to burn the flag because if we didn't, the flag wouldn't mean anything worth protecting in the first place." Dravik was quiet for a long moment, his scales cycling slowly through colors that suggested deep thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice lacking the confidence it had held at the beginning of class. "You're saying that Valthorans serve the symbol, while humans make the symbol serve them." "I'm saying that Valthorans have confused the symbol with the thing it symbolizes," Morrison said. "You've made the map more important than the territory, the representation more sacred than the reality. And that's a problem, because maps need to be redrawn when the territory changes. Representations need to evolve when the reality they represent evolves. If you can't burn the old map, you can't draw a new one." She saved her notes and looked around at the class. "For next session, I want each of you to research one example from your own species' history, where adherence to traditional symbols or methods prevented necessary adaptation to changing circumstances. And I want you to contrast it with an example where questioning tradition led to positive change. We'll discuss what makes the difference between helpful skepticism and destructive chaos." The students began gathering their materials, the usual end-of-class rustle. But Dravik remained seated, staring at the pile of ash that had been the flag. Morrison walked over to him as the other students filed out. "Cadet Corhenna, are you all right?" "I thought I was proving a point about human weakness," he said quietly. "Instead, you demonstrated that I've been taught to treat symbols as more important than truth." "Not quite," Morrison said, her voice gentler now. "You've been taught that unity requires sacred, unquestionable elements. That's not entirely wrong. Societies do need common ground, shared values, things that bind people together. The question is whether those binding elements should be so sacred that they can never be examined, questioned, or changed. Your empire chose one answer. Humanity chose another. Neither approach is perfect. But yours kept you from collapsing when you encountered problems," Dravik said. "Sometimes," Morrison admitted. "Other times, our willingness to question everything led to fragmentation and civil conflict. We've paid a high price for our particular form of cultural evolution. It's not obviously superior to yours, just different, with different costs and different benefits." Dravik stood, towering over the human professor. "I need to think about this," That's what education is for, Morrison said, making you uncomfortable with certainties you came in with. As Dravik left, Morrison looked down at the pile of ash, then disposed of it properly in the recycling unit. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was already composing her report on the lesson, including the note that she'd need to fabricate another cheap flag before the next section of the course came through. Outside the classroom windows, the stars turned in their eternal dance, indifferent to flags and symbols and the endless debate about what made a civilization worthy of the name. The galaxy kept spinning, empires rose and fell, and somewhere on a space station between the stars, students were learning that maybe, just maybe, the things they'd always been taught to hold sacred might be worth questioning after all. Professor Morrison pulled up her schedule for the next class, Introduction to Human Military Tactics, which would be fun because she'd have to explain to species with strictly hierarchical command structures how human forces could function effectively despite allowing soldiers to question orders. That was going to be another interesting conversation. She smiled to herself. 12 years of teaching, and she still got students who thought they could score easy points by attacking human cultural primitiveness. 12 years. And she still enjoyed watching the moment when they realized that humanity's seeming chaos was actually a highly refined form of adaptive evolution in action. The ash from the flag was gone now, recycled into base elements that would be reconstituted into something useful. Just like every human symbol that had ever been destroyed, broken down, remade, repurposed for whatever came next. Behind her, on the wall of the classroom, hung an actual, authentic historical flag, a genuine article from Earth's 21st century, protected in a preservation field. She'd never mentioned it to the class, never pointed it out. It was there not as a sacred object, but as a reminder. Humans preserved their history even as they refused to be trapped by it. The flag on the wall remained untouched. The flag she'd burned was gone. Both were exactly where they needed to be. And somewhere in the student dormitories, a Valtheran cadet was questioning everything he'd been taught about the sacred nature of symbols, which meant that Professor Morrison had done her job correctly for another semester. The galaxy kept turning. Symbols rose and fell, and humanity, messy and argumentative and constantly burning its own representations, somehow kept adapting to whatever came next. It was, Morrison reflected, a pretty good trick for a supposedly primitive species. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses